Tito kind of, as the president of Yugoslavia, post-war, post-partisan, post-communist period, was a kind of glue that held the nation state together. And obviously when he passed away, a lot of tensions that were kind of kept under control under his leadership began to resurface. The conflict in the former Yugoslavia was brewing in the late 80s. You could see some of the fault lines were beginning to emerge between the Croats and the Serbs at this point in places like Knin along the borders of what was then Croatia. And you know, whenever I went, people would say, yes, you know, tensions are rising, you know, Milosevic is sort of promoting this very sort of pro-Serbian nationalism. There may be a conflict, something may be happening, we're not quite sure, but we don't think anything's going to happen in Bosnia because Bosnia is too ethnically mixed. So I think one of the problems with looking at the former Yugoslavia is the way in which it's often cast as a kind of ethnic, nationalist, you know, religious divide. But I think the problem with that is that it's much more complex than that and much more subtle. And in fact, some politicians who for their own personal agendas or their own political agendas used the kind of the myth, as it were, of ethnic and religious divides as a way to fulfill their own ends. So it's a bit of a smokescreen in a way because, you know, before the conflict, Bosnians, Muslims, Croats, Serbs, it almost didn't really matter. It was just like, you know, those were not major differences. And people lived very happily together. There were lots of intermarriages, lots of mixed marriages. And religion wasn't really an issue, certainly under Tito, under the socialist regime. It was a non-issue. There wasn't that kind of sense of division. But unfortunately, when Milosevic came to power in Serbia, I think he recognized that he could use Serbian nationalism and religion as a way of furthering his own political agenda and his own political ideology. And he used that as a way of driving apart Yugoslavia, forcing a kind of wedge, as it were, between the Serbs living in the other Yugoslav states of Croatia and particularly Bosnia, and encouraging them to become part of this kind of greater Serbia ideal. There was no reason why Bosnia had to go the way it did. There was a systematic, planned process led by Serbia and by the Bosnian Serbs to dismember the country, to divide it up, to hack it to pieces basically, and to ethnically cleanse the Bosnian Muslims from those parts of Bosnia which the Serbs considered to be Serbian effectively. I mean, I went out into Slovenia in 1990 when the Slovenian war erupted. For the Slovenians, they kind of got off lightly because there was no Serb minority or even majority in Slovenia. Slovenia is relatively speaking ethnically similar. It's almost all Slovenes. So I think Milosevic realized that Slovenia, he was never going to be able to kind of, you know, hold on to it. So he allowed Slovenia, in a sense, to go. So Slovenia was kind of the first domino, and obviously then the attention then shifted towards Croatia and what was going to happen there. And the tensions were definitely ratcheting up. I went out to eastern Croatia along the border there with Serbia when the first firefights started to happen. It was incredibly strange. You know, it was a very strange thing because you're there in a European country with a lot of European sort of sensibilities on a front line with militiamen, soldiers basically, who were learning to be soldiers. They had hunting rifles. Because it was happening, you know, literally to everyday people, and their lives were being transformed from, they weren't career soldiers. This was kind of very much a kind of, you know, neighbor against neighbor almost. So the Croatian War then really escalated into a full-scale conflict around Vukovar, which I didn't cover, but, you know, the impact of that was reverberating through the whole region. In early June 1992, and there was the story of this bread queue massacre, the infamous bread queue massacre at the start of the war in Sarajevo, where, you know, a lot of people had been killed by a shell while they were waiting to queue for food, basically. And it was the beginnings of the siege. Where it's like almost like an experiment in human psychology, taking a modern Western, effectively, city, and then reduce that to a medieval siege. Take it back to the 14th century with no electricity, no gas, constant shelling, constant attack from the hills around it. I mean, the front lines went up in Sarajevo very, very quickly, almost overnight, and there were families that were separated by that. And there were some extraordinary stories, particularly at the beginning of the war, about how people managed to keep in touch with each other. So, for example, one of the tricks at the beginning was that the taxi drivers still were working. They had radios. There were no telephones. The telephone wires were all cut. But the taxi drivers had a radio. So what you could do is call a taxi driver on your side, get in the car. They would drive as close as they could to the front line. On the radio, they would call their colleague who was on the other side. He would then drive to the person that you were trying to get hold of's apartment or house, pick them up, drive back to the front line, then you would talk to each other on the taxi radios. And even more bizarrely, that was happening with the soldiers. So there was one particular unit, the Bosnian Police Special Forces unit, and it's split up, quite early on in the war. So the kind of Serbian members went to the Serbian side, and the Bosnian and Croatians stayed on the other side. But they still had the same radios because they were part of the same unit, and they would be on the front line with each other, saying, "Listen, tonight I'm on duty. Don't shoot." I mean, one of the really scary things about Sarajevo was that you never knew whether you were in the sights of a sniper, because they were really clever but also very brutal. And there were obviously certain intersections, or what became famously known as Sniper's Alley, where they would shoot regularly. And it was, I did a series of pictures at the beginning of the war, for example, people running across this intersection that they had to cross to get from one side of the city to the other. A lot of time they were doing that to come to meet friends, to just sort of be part of the fabric of the city. They're risking their lives essentially to be citizens of the city, which I find extraordinary. And I spent a lot of time photographing people sprinting across this intersection, trying to get to the other side, risking their lives literally. But as the war dragged on, that became a really unpleasant experience to photograph, because you did start to feel like a vulture, because you were there essentially waiting to see if somebody got shot. So as I said, the thing that I found unique about the siege of Sarajevo was the way that the civilian population responded to that, and found all sorts of extraordinary creative ways to get through it. Because you have to remember, at the beginning, obviously they thought it was going to be over in days, if not weeks, but it ground on for months and then years. So people had to become incredibly inventive in finding strategies to get through the day, to find food, to find water, constructing all these amazing sort of homemade carts to carry wood, to carry food, because the standpipe, you had to go, maybe a kilometre or 2 kilometres to a standpipe to collect water. But obviously as the war dragged on, the front lines became more solid. The black market emerged, and there were all sorts of deals were being done where, weapons and certainly food and cigarettes were being smuggled in, and huge profits were made, obviously in the black market and so on. At the height of the siege, a kilo of coffee cost you 100 German marks, which, 10 times what it would cost in the normal world. Everyday things, ordinary food, became almost unattainable for the average people. So people had to resort to growing food, and all the parks were turned into vegetable gardens. Times of people literally living off leaves. They were gathering leaves from the, nettle leaves to make soup. The people of Sarajevo, I think, made it almost like a collective decision. They weren't going to just sit in their cellars like rats, cowering from the aggression. They were going to try and live as much as they could like citizens of the city, because it became a defense of the civic values, of the sort of things that we in democratic civilization think are important. Because it's a city of 300,000 people, it's the capital city, full of educated middle-class elites, basically doctors, nurses, writers, journalists, artists, engineers. Everybody found their own unique creative way to get through the situation. And one of the things I found really fascinating was the way that artists and creative people responded to this. As I said, by defending not just the city with their bodies by going to the front line and fighting, but also with their minds. So putting on cultural events. You would go to a chamber music recital by the city's chamber quartet, and they kept on doing it even through the war. I think for myself, and like a lot of the journalists in Bosnia, there was a big ethical challenge as a journalist, because we were reporting on the ground that this was a war of aggression, that there was one side that was, by any conventional standard, the aggressor, and the other side was the victim. But that was not the narrative that was being put through in the capitals of Washington and New York, Washington and Paris and London. The narrative there was this was ancient ethnic hatreds, every side was equally responsible for it, nobody was good, they were all bad, we shouldn't get involved, let's not go there, basically. Just over 10,000 people were killed in the siege of Sarajevo, and about 60,000 were wounded, which means that out of a population of sort of 300,000, you had about a 1 in 5 chance of being either killed or wounded, which is an extraordinary figure, which included 1,000 children. And so the toll was very heavy. And in the entire of Bosnia, the number is something around 100,000 accepted were killed. Most of those were civilians, and most of them were killed in mass murder, basically. Most of them were executed. You know, in Sarajevo, thankfully, Srebrenica never fell, so there were never the mass executions that we saw of Srebrenica. The Srebrenica massacre wasn't, the total numbers killed there were around 8,000, which in terms of the bigger scheme of things of 100,000 dead is relatively small. But it all happened in one discrete moment. And I think it was very hard for the Western governments to pretend that they didn't know it was coming, because, you know, there have been constant reports that if Srebrenica fell, this would happen. And when it fell, it did happen. That became such a huge moment that Western governments, you know, particularly the American government, couldn't then justify not intervening. That then lined up with the fact that in late 1995, the offensive, the balance of forces started to switch in favor of the Croats and the Bosnian forces, and they began to win some victories against the Serbians. And there was a sense in Western capitals, I think, that if they didn't end the war now, then there was going to be an even bigger kind of crisis, because large parts of what was then Republika Srpska would have fallen into Bosnian hands, and they felt like they had to kind of force the stalemate at that point. So actually, once the Western governments decided that they wanted the war to end, it ended pretty fast. There was a sort of fairly limited intervention in terms of air bombardment, and a much harder line was taken with the Serbian leadership. And because they realized that the tide was being turned militarily against them as well, they accepted a kind of what became the Dayton Agreement. After the war finished, there was something around 30,000–40,000 people unaccounted for, whose bodies were, they didn't know where they were. There were 8,000 from Srebrenica, from the massacre there, but then there were another 20,000 or so in scattered graves all over the countryside, particularly obviously in eastern Bosnia, around Prijedor and Banja Luka, and then obviously in the areas around Srebrenica and the mountains and the hills surrounding that. Obviously, there were some Serbs missing and some Croats, but by comparison, the vast majority of the missing were Bosnian Muslims. When the weather is good, they would go out, locate a series of graves, carry out an exhumation very carefully, dig up the bodies, check them forensically, identify them, use this very complex and very difficult process of identification using DNA sampling, and bury the body at the end. So this kind of process of grief and the release of the grief by the fact you have a body and a grave that you can identify and say, yes, this is where my loved one has been, where the remains have been left to rest.